Yeah.
Okay. Ready?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so could you, in your own words, define a psychopath?
Well, there's a psychopath is somebody that has four main sort of characteristics of abnormal personality traits and behaviour. The first is they have a particular interpersonal style, which is considered to be exploitative of others, very egocentric, narcissistic, somewhat grandiose, to be able to gift to the gab, being very glib but quite superficial, particular ability to manipulate others in social interactions. That's one component. The other component is that they have an abnormal affect. I mean, in terms of emotions. Okay, their emotional inner world is quite abnormal, and they typically are cold and callous, and do not have an emotional depth. Quite ruthless. It's a feeling that it's just not there. The third part is that many are highly impulsive, and you look at that over the life course. And then the third part, which is a bit debatable, is a particular history of criminality. So multiple types of different crimes, failures of supervision after committing a crime, and crime from an early age. Now, Mr. Brady would not score particularly highly on that. He wasn't actually caught repeatedly for lots of different crimes. But the other sides of his, particularly the first two I described, the affective abnormality and his sort of interpersonal style, are very strong, very apparent. Do you want to shut the window, because you're getting noises? You may be picking up recordings out there. You have to be, yes.
There we go.
You might find that is. You've got enough light, have you? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fine. Good.
Okay. Right.
So
my next question would be, in terms of psychopathy, where would you place Ian Brady on the scale?
well, in terms of exceptionally severe. Apart from this sort of rather unrealistic scoring system we have, where we perhaps attribute too much to the criminal history, but he is very severely psychopathic, in my opinion.
Could you describe to me your first meeting with Ian Brady? What was the atmosphere like?
Well, the atmosphere that was when I first meet him, he was actually quite pleasant and courteous, and looked to me rather like a rather shabby Oxford Don in a sports jacket. He had a sort of shock of grey hair. He was clearly aged by that time, but he had a sort of, had it not been for some of the shabbiness of the clothes, he might have actually been slightly more sort of impressive. But he certainly had a particular demeanour. What happened during the interview was that it became clear it was very difficult to interrupt him. This is a man who was so self-centered that he did not want to do anything but to talk about himself and about his feelings for others, his negative feelings towards others. So it was a very difficult interview in that sense.
What was Ian Brady's demeanour like towards you?
Towards me, I think that I don't think I particularly mattered very much. I was there for a purpose, for something he wanted, which was to have a public mental health review tribunal. I think, if I'm honest, it would be my reaction to him, which is perhaps my internal reaction. And it's difficult to explain this because it's a professional matter. But I think that if you're an experienced forensic psychiatry, it's important to be aware of how your patients, your clients, make you feel, and make you feel towards them. I mean, obviously, if they made you afraid. No, he didn't make me afraid at all. But he produced in me a profoundly negative feeling, a feeling of personal dislike of him that grew and grew as the interview went on. And that is not a very helpful feeling to have as a forensic psychiatrist, and it's a sort of technical term in psychodynamics called countertransference. And so actually what I believed I was experiencing, he was doing something to me that to my inner world in terms of my relationship to him, and it became quite clear that he was attempting to control me throughout the interview as much as he could, and that as time went on, but I was very struck that I have seen offenders who've committed extremely unpleasant and even sometimes possibly even worse murders, but have not managed to produce such a negative reaction in me.
Were you vetted at all before meeting him? A sort of like, he may be like this, he may act like that sort of thing?
So vetted by
like staff?
No. It's a fairly typical routine type of procedure where an external expert, a professional like myself, comes along to do an interview, this time on this occasion for his solicitor.
Did he ever go into detail about his crimes or reference them in any way?
No, he did not go in detail, and I'm not aware that he ever really has in the detail that one would like. I think that the exact motivation of his criminality in terms of the homicides has never been entirely revealed. So what he did do, and of course in an interview like this I would want to ask him, so he actually has been considered by colleagues on the basis of the information available and what is known about the offences to be a sadistic murderer. So right from the start, when he was on remand, there are reports which I've read, but they never go into, they just assume that he has a perverse inner world and that the motivation for his crimes are sadistic pleasure in murdering children and quite possibly torture. What he said himself, he denied that he tortured the children physically. What he said was he tortured them mentally, but he was implying to me that he scared them to death, basically, and that was the form of torture, is what he told me at interview that he carried out on the children. It is widely believed that he sexually assaulted 2 or more of the children before killing them.
When speaking with him, did he ever show any sign of remorse for what he did?
Not only did he not show remorse, that he made it clear that he never would. I asked him about remorse, and to which he referred to remorse as wind, and that if they wanted wind, they would wait till doomsday before they got it.
Did he ever give any indication as to his reasoning for his crimes?
No, he did not give any indication. I think this has to be inferred from what is known about him and his general demeanour. It's clear that the enjoyment of control is very much part of his everyday life, and with everybody he interacted with. Everything for him was a battle of control, and in the case of sadistic murderers, typically control is an issue, and can be one of the key issues. So actually control over life and death, control over the victim, and actually getting pleasure from that control.
You've interviewed notorious prisoners such as Peter Sutcliffe and Bronson.
Yes.
How does interviewing Ian Brady compare to other interviews you have conducted?
Much more difficult, and much more challenging.
In what way?
In terms of his attempt throughout to maintain control, whilst the feeling of having a game played with you, whilst giving you little tidbits of information and indications. Unwillingness to go any further, and what I described earlier is that profoundly negative feeling that came over me about him, the so-called countertransference, for want of a better term, as the interview progressed. And the feeling that there is no such diagnosis as egomania, or there might have been in the 19th century, but if such a condition existed, I would have to say that he was suffering from it. So he was particularly challenging in that sense.
In his mental health tribunal, Brady said that he adopted the techniques of method actor Stanislavski to feign mental illness to gain transfer from prison to hospital. Do you think he could have been capable of doing this?
I think he may have been capable of doing it, but I think a different question is, do I believe that he did it to get himself transferred? No, I don't. I believe that he became severely mentally ill and was correctly judged by those who finally assessed him and recommended his transfer to hospital as being psychotic. I think the most likely diagnosis being delusional disorder. And so I don't believe that he feigned mental illness. Do I believe that he was capable of intelligent enough to do such a thing? Yes, but no when it comes to the actual transfer to hospital.
What was your impression of Brady's hunger strike? Do you think it was another power game to show others that he was in control?
I think it was, and it also to show his protest. I think that it was something that he was extremely angry with the way that he had been handled. I think he had some grounds for complaint when he was restrained too forcibly, resulting in the fracture to his wrist. And so his rage at the hospital authorities continued for years after, and so he was effectively in a battle. But was I convinced by it? So when I saw him, he had a nasogastric tube, but he also had it looked like 2 pints of tea in a large mug to drink. He didn't actually drink it. He was actually too interested in talking about himself. I noticed he never sipped it, but I don't think that's because he didn't want the tea. The key thing was I was not entirely convinced at the reality of his hunger strike. I have had people under my care who've been in a genuine hunger strike. I do not believe Mr. Brady was genuinely in a hunger strike.
Malcolm McCulloch suggested that during a search for Keith Bennett back in the 1980s, Brady had gone onto the moors to check the burial site without letting on that he knew. Do you think this may have been possible? I
think that's a very plausible idea of Professor McCulloch. That's quite possible. I mean, just to actually be sure that nothing had been disturbed, he was still in control of the knowledge. On the other hand, it's possible that he genuinely didn't remember exactly the location of the grave. One can't be sure, but I would sort of think that was possibly a more plausible explanation.
Would he have found pleasure in knowing something the police didn't, and would he have used this to his advantage?
He would have had great pleasure in knowing something the police didn't know. It's an interesting question as to whether he would have been to his advantage, because he clearly, right in the outset when he was on remand and they discovered photographs, for example, Myra Hindley seated, there was clearly there would have been pleasure probably for both of them, knowing that the photographs concealed unmarked graves, but actually it wasn't to his advantage. That's one game that he well and truly lost, because the police were able to put it together and actually find the location of that particular body.
You were aware of the letter given to his former mental health advocate Jackie Powell, which supposedly gave information to be revealed upon his death that may disclose the burial site of Keith Bennett. Was this, do you think, a genuine gesture or another game to please his psychopathic personality?
Well, the bottom line is that I don't know, because I don't know what that envelope contains. But knowing at that, my hunch would have been that it didn't really contain anything at all. I could be wrong, but I would have thought that would have been one of his final games. If indeed it were opened after the grade, it wouldn't surprise me if that was one of his final games, not actually revealing anything.
Dr. Alan Keatley, one of Brady's close confidants and legal heir to Brady's possessions, recently released a book about Brady, giving a first account of the Moors story told by Brady. And in one of the chapters, Brady said to Dr. Keatley, whenever asked about the murders, Occasionally, I have to use mental blocks whenever I am asked a question about my case, especially a leading question. Do you think what he did to those children affected him in any way?
I wouldn't have thought so in the sense I think implied by that question. I would have thought that he has a mental block, not so much a mental block, that actually requires a few seconds to think very carefully about what he's going to say next, so as not to incriminate himself or give anything away. So, I mean, has he? I know that there are some colleagues who believe that serious offenders sometimes can get PTSD as a result of what he did. So there's any implication of he was suffering, I would not give any credence to that whatsoever.
Are you aware of someone called Gertrude Stein?
I'm aware of her, but not in this context.
She was once quoted saying, "There ain't no answer, there ain't going to be any answer, there never has been an answer, that's the answer." Is this way of thinking similar to Ian Brady's psychological possession of information that he constantly withheld from police about Keith Bennett and his constant need for power and control?
Well, I think that's would be a summary of what he's asserting, but of course there is an answer, and it's just that he wanted to keep it to himself and not give it away.
He always saw himself to be grandiose and above most people. When interviewing him, did this come across at all?
Yes, it did. Very much so. That's probably one of the reasons I had a negative impression of him, was his that of course may say more about me than it does him, in terms of, if you're an experienced professional, you don't like somebody who thinks they are perhaps with superior intelligence to you, because that is one of the ways that he came across very strongly the day I interviewed him. Yes, I think I would agree with what you're putting to me.
In your professional opinion, when Brady was sentenced in May 1966,
yes,
do you think he should have immediately been incarcerated inside a psychiatric hospital instead of prison? Because anyone who commits crimes such as his must have a mental attribute contributing to it.
No, not at that time. I think we have to go back to what was actually happening at that particular time. It was an interesting time. The death penalty was
abolished 6 months before.
Yes, very shortly before. And I think that there would not be... at that time, they did sometimes admit sadistic murderers for treatment under the Mental Health Act to Broadmoor. So there was that. So it was a possibility. And that sometimes it can be by chance, as to who your lawyer was, and did the lawyer instruct a psychiatrist and say that my client is abnormal, were the grounds for diminished responsibility or insanity. So that did occasionally, it was a possibility at that time. Certainly what has happened increasingly since was that there was considerable concern with individuals with that severity of perversion and potential dangerousness to be an entire liability, because once those individuals got out, they might have found not to respond in any way, shape or form, and still be exceptionally dangerous. So there's an interesting tradition amongst forensic psychiatrists which has changed over time as to what you do with a sadistic murderer. And what I could say now is you would keep them out at all costs unless it's clear that they have a severe mental illness. So, but at that time he was not presenting with symptoms of severe mental illness, so it would not have been appropriate.
Do you think, had he not been caught, that he would have continued to kill?
I have no doubt he would have continued to kill if he had not been caught.
What is your view on reports that Ian Brady had killed more people than he was convicted of?
Well, you don't know really, do you? But that was what he was strongly intimating to me. He said to me when I interviewed him about, and I was convicted, he wasn't actually convicted, but his actual words, and I wrote them down, was that he was convicted of 5 killings, and he said, and note my use of those words. And the way my understanding of what he was telling me was to make the point that he had killed more. I don't know whether that was true, whether it was one of his games, what he was what he was intending to do by that, but it would certainly, if it was, whether it was true or not, it was to enhance his position and general bearing as a pretty heavy-duty killer.
Could something in Ian Brady's childhood contributed to his behaviour in adult life?
That's very interesting. I think that most cases you see, there are many things in their childhood that contribute to their adult life. I'm not aware of anything in his childhood which is sufficient to explain what he did. And I see him as particularly interesting in that. The notion of people being born bad is not a very politically correct thing, but I think that some individuals are, and have seen individuals with who have killed children, interestingly enough, as well as being psychopathic, where you cannot find any explanation from their childhood. Most of them you do find quite a lot of explanations, but for some who are particularly interesting, you feel almost in the presence of somebody who was born like that, that they just became like that for some reason. We have no idea what it is.
Referring back to Dr. Keatley's book about Brady, he references the letters sent to him by Winnie Johnson. He said to Dr. Keatley that he couldn't bring himself to open the letters knowing that her son's body was still undiscovered. What do you think about that?
You only put yourself in the position, you sort of want to open them up straight away, most people, but an interesting sort of position, but it's not really for me to say, and I think perhaps that is something for him to consider, because he may have reasons which he believes are entirely genuine and correct and proper.
Do you think he would have found it hard?
I have no idea. I don't think I should really comment on that, to be quite honest.
Both Hindley and Brady took photographs as mementos.
Yes.
Some were taken of Keith Bennett as he lay dying, but on Brady's instruction were buried. That's according to Myra Hindley's testimony to Duncan staff.
Yes.
However, the photographs and tape recording of Leslie and Downey remained. Surely they would have listened back to the tape to reminisce. What effect would these mementos have on them when they would look at them? Would it spur them on to commit another murder or take them back to that moment of death?
It would certainly be the latter, taking them back to the moment of death, and could indeed, and does in most cases. The keeping of trophies is absolutely typical in serial killers and indeed sadistic murderers. The serial killer is somebody who's killed three or more, but actually in these cases often the underlying motivation is sadism, and so reminiscences of the sadistic act are enormously pleasurable, and indeed some offenders will masturbate to photographs or tape recordings, or today webcam videos. Indeed a killer in Hong Kong recently had all his killings and dismemberment of the two female victims actually videoed.
Have you heard the tape recording of Leslie and Downey?
I haven't personally heard it, no.
If you were asked to listen to it in a professional thing, would you listen to it or not?
I would listen to it, yes, in professional capacity.
To finish off, were you happy not to have any further involvement with Ian Brady after you were sent to review him?
I no, in the sense I think you mean that was I so put off. No, I felt privileged in my role as a forensic psychiatrist to have seen him. I think it's a wonderful job. And you see some extraordinary human beings in this. So I would have been very happy to see him again, and to learn more about him and more from him.
Yeah. I've just got one more question, it's not on there. You said before that you said he didn't seem human. What did you mean by that?
There's a feeling of how do I say, that the normal humanity that you encounter in most people was missing. This is something which some of the features of psychopathy, which I was talking about earlier, that lack of emotion and callousness, which was when it's so extreme, which it was in him, that was it. But there's a feeling sometimes that you get with individuals with very severe psychopathic states that they are not wired up properly, that there's an illogicality in some of the offending behaviour and some of what they do. I don't think so much in Brady's case that was the case in terms of offending. I think it all fitted very well, the profile of a sadistic murderer. But in terms of him, his incredible desire for control of every aspect was way and above anything I've seen. So this sort of feeling that he at times is so egocentric, that he's so unconcerned about anybody else, that you feel that there is almost a psychotic aspect to the man, that there's so little feeling for others that you almost wonder if there are autistic features about him in terms of his desire to control. That's not a diagnosis that anybody's actually applied to him, but I wonder, now we know a lot more about that condition, if there were certain features of him that fitted that. And so this lack of normal humanity that you feel, there was no concern about anybody apart from himself. And then one felt that his whole being was in a constant battle with authority, and in a constant battle to maintain control of every aspect of his social interactions with everybody else. And that it is quite likely that over many years he'd remember with some considerable pleasure his killings and what he had done, but was so controlled he would not disclose, but it would enjoy playing with people and hinting at what he might have done and might not have done.
Yeah. But I think that's everything, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Was that okay? So I got what you needed?
I think so, definitely.
Good.